Good morning. Last episode, we were talking about the economics and climate change and its impact on potential impact on Nevada. That is that grapes are a very economic crop. They produce a fair bit of money. There was a study done at UNR by a graduate student that showed that grapes were much more economical than alfalfa on a per acre basis. I encourage you to check that out. And if you're interested, I can send you information. Climate change is making it unpredictable, but it's clear that today's environment will not be the same 20 years from now. And it's predicted in 20 years from now that the growing conditions in this area will be better for grapes. So that's the take-home message from the previous episode. Today, we will talk about site selection. That is, where can we grow the best quality grapes and how do we choose that? I'll also talk a bit about soil testing and how to read the soil test and what to look for in your soils. So the ultimate goal here is not only do we want production of our grapes, but we want production of quality grapes to produce quality wines. If you talk to winemakers, I've heard various estimates, but almost all of them agree that you can't make good wine without good quality grapes. And they're estimates from, and I don't know how you can really make these estimates, but this is how important it is to them, that between 75% to 90% of the quality of the wine comes from the original grapes. And grape quality is largely dependent upon the climate that we've talked about, but also soils and the area around it, the quality of the water, the weather, and those things are called terroir. It's referred to as not just, terroir often gets interpreted as the soil, but terroir really means a place, which includes everything about that place. The genetics, the grape, the soil, the climate, the weather, the pathogens in the area, everything about that place contributes to the particular quality of that grape. Okay, so what do we do about site selection? It's so important because your grapes are going to be in the ground for 20, maybe 50, maybe even 100 years. So where you place those grapes is very important. You're not going to just want to tear them out and put them in somewhere else again without great cost. So one of the first places what you want to look at is your climate in your area suitable for growing grapes? And we talked prior to this in the previous episode about growing degree days. And so you're looking for optimum growing degree days, and you can do that at Desert Research Institute at this website that I have located, are spelled out right here, where you can look at your local region. They have weather stations all over the Western United States, and you can, and they produce information there, including growing degree days. Now, they have different growing degree days. You want to make sure you select the growing degree days with a base of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, because 50 degrees is the condition for grapes where grapes actually grow above 50 degrees. If you choose a 40 degree, you're not going to get the right information. So you want a base of 50, and you're looking for an area that has growing degree days for optimum growing of grapes between 25 and 3,500. As the grapes that we are using, generally speaking, from France, Italy, and Spain, in more northernly regions. You also would like, ideally, to have an area where you have frost-free days of 150 days or more. Second important consideration, you don't always have a choice for this if you already own the land, but is to have a sloping land. I've seen around the world, I've traveled around the world, all the best grape growing regions come from areas that have sloping land. And well-drained sites are preferred. That is, grapes do not like wet feet, so you don't want a flat, low-lying, boggy area. Ideally, 2% to 3% slope or greater is the best site. You want to avoid those valleys. You want to avoid poorly drained sites. Those are going to create problems for you in the future. The slope does two things. It allows for air drainage. That is, cold air in the fall or spring is going to sink and go to the lowest regions of the property. So that's where frost is going to occur first, and the air is going to move past on a slope the area that your grapes are on. In addition, that's where water is going to settle and it's going to be the boggiest or wettest area. So on a slope, you're going to have better drainage of the soil. Let me get mine to move forward here. Okay, so if you were to go to the Desert Research Institute website, you may see something like this. You find your particular area. It's going to give you a map here. Whoops, somehow we went backwards. It's going to give you an area where all of these different weather stations are in the state of Nevada, for example, and you can click on them and see what your particular weather is like in your region. Now, it's not going to represent necessarily your particular property. So if you have time, I'd encourage you to put your own weather station on the property. And you'll get new information, but you're not going to get past information. You can get the maximum, minimum temperatures, snow depth, etc., precipitation, and there are other pages in which you can get the average growing degree days and other sorts of information. This is what we're afraid of in the spring, frost damage. So in this particular case, Chardonnay was breaking the earliest. So bud break, when the buds are enclosed, if we look in an area here, we're just seeing a bud starting to break right here in this region. This is a more protected grape. You notice that the buds had already broken here up high. So at the end of a shoot, the first buds to break are at the end of the shoot, or at the end of a cane at this point, because they're woody, so we call them a cane. And those ones are then going to be much more susceptible to frost damage once they've broken bud. When they're dormant, they're less likely to, and I don't know why my page keeps changing here, but it is, they're much less likely to be damaged by frost. So in this particular example, what's happened is we had a frost when just a few buds were breaking, and these other buds were dormant at the time of the frost, and so then they broke later after the frost was past, the frost risk, and they continue to produce, and you can see flowers coming here that are going to produce fruit. The other buds are either killed, as in this example, or you may get, there are actually three buds in a, three buds in a cluster there, and the secondary buds may break, but you'll get reduced yields. If those get damaged, but you still have tertiary buds, you'll get very little fruit. So in this particular year, our yields were down about half of what they normally were as a result of this frost damage. We'll come back to this when we talk about viticultural practices and what we can do to help protect our grapes from getting frost damage. Okay, so what do we want in an ideal vineyard site? Ideally, we want full sunlight. We want to be free of late spring and early fall frosts. We want good air drainage. That is, we would like to have sloping land, as in this image here. We want well-drained soils, and that would include things like more sandy soils rather than clay soils, which are heavier and don't drain as quickly. And ideally, we want a region or an area where we're free of -10 degree temperatures And I say in midwinter here because that's when they're most dormant. Actually, if -10 were to occur earlier in the fall or later in the spring, they would even be more damaged because grapes are in their deepest dormancy state, which is their most protected state against cold in mid-January in the Northern Hemisphere. Okay, soil type. So grapes prefer well-drained soils. Ideally, you would want at least a 4 to 5 foot depth with no hard pan. Grapes can grow, I've seen them grow as deep as 50 feet deep if you have really good soils. And that I saw in France where they grew right through the soil into a cave down below. So it is possible for them to go that deep. The deeper your roots, the better your drought tolerance, and you're able to not have to irrigate or worry so much about water conditions. Heavy clay soils should be avoided. However, there's a caveat to that. I saw a very interesting thing when I was visiting Cheval Blanc in Bordeaux. My good friend there, Kees van Leeuwen, who is the vineyard manager and professor, showed me that the best soils that they have in Cheval Blanc, which is a world-renowned vineyard and winery, were clay soils, in fact. But the difference was that these clay soils were cracking clays, and the grapevines' roots were growing down through the cracks, which enabled them to have good oxygenation and allow for the roots to effectively operate and absorb water. Now, the other benefit of these heavy clay soils was grapes actually produce better quality grapes when they're drought stressed. We've done a lot of research here in our site to show this, and others have shown this as well. The conductivity of water through heavy clay soils is slow, which means that the water that's being taken up and transpired by the leaves of the grapevine was faster than the water could be delivered to the roots through the soil and these cracking clay soils. And as a result, produced a slightly drought-stressed vine, and this is also what contributed to the high quality of the grapes that they were producing. So they have different soil sites on their property, and they were able to determine that this particular soil site was the best, and it happened to be these cracking clays. So there's always exceptions to these rules. I'm giving you generals about what we know, but there are always going to be site selective differences that that might give you some sort of advantage from the norm. Okay. Generally speaking, grapes have low water requirements and low mineral nutrient requirements. I like to tell people that they're weeds. They grow almost anywhere. They don't always grow well, but they can grow almost anywhere. And you'll have to do very little to keep them growing. I've tried to kill grapevines without watering them to the point where the pot's been dry for a month, and then we go and water them again and they sprout back out and they come back. So it's very hard to kill them. Under general good soils, they don't require much in the way of fertilization. You need to do soil tests to be sure of that and make sure that you're not having mineral deficiencies in your soil or mineral toxicities, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Saline soils should be absolutely avoided. Grapevines are very sensitive to salinity, and we'll go back to that in the soil test that we're going to look at here. So how do we determine our site's suitability? If we have an ideal situation, we could have a backhoe where we can dig deeply into the ground and go through the soil profile and look at how deep our soil is, what the texture of that soil is, whether we have rocks or boulders, whether we have a hard pan, whether we're going to need to break through that hard pan. That will tell you a lot. And you could go down 10 feet and with a backhoe and look at that soil profile if it's possible. And that'll give you some idea of the growing conditions that your roots are going to be exploring. You need to do a soil test. You want to test for the soil texture, that is whether it's clay or sand or some combination. You want to look for the number of minerals that you have that we know are important for essential mineral elements for plants to grow in. And a soil testing company will do that for you. You want to also test for pathogens. If you've grown other crops in that soil before, for example, you may have nematodes or other potential problems. Phylloxera is another big problem around the world. We don't have it yet, as far as I know, here in Nevada, but phylloxera is the main reason that people grow grapes with rootstocks. And again, we'll come back to this later. So we've used A&L Western Laboratories. Here's a link again for that, and you can go to their website and they will give you instructions. You want to specify that you're going to be growing grapes on the property, and they do the soil test evaluation and give you results based upon the kind of crop that you're growing. You'd also like to check out your water availability. How much water do you have access to? Do you have water rights? Can you use a well? What's the quality of that water in the well? What's the quality of the water, of the irrigation water that's being sent to you? Because that water is going to go on the soil. Whatever salts or minerals are in that are going to be deposited in that soil, because as the water evaporates, it's going to leave those minerals behind, and they could potentially accumulate. This is a major source for salinity and other problems such as boron. This is a type of a soil analysis report you might get back from A&L. Here's one where we've looked at the soil. It's telling us about the organic matter here. It's telling us our phosphorus, our potassium, our magnesium, calcium, sodium, which is undesirable, our pH of the soil. In this case, the soil's way too high. We would like to have the pH around between 6 and 7, ideally. Sometimes we can get around with up to 7.5 in this area, but you're starting to run into some nutrient imbalances. Soil pH controls the balance of available nutrients in the soil. It's very important to control that pH if you can. And we'll talk about the recommendations here for this soil in a moment. It also gives you something about the cation exchange capacity. This is the ability of the soil to bind soluble salts to the soil. A low cation exchange capacity, which would be the case in a sandy soil, means that it has very little nutritional support to the plant. Clay soils have the highest cation exchange capacity and would have a lot of minerals. So this gives you some information. If you're not sure about this, you may need to consult a soil scientist to get recommendations on what you need to do with your soil. And this is saturation is telling you the percentage on that cation exchange capacity. So we can see that calcium, which is a good thing, is representing 50% of that cation exchange. Then we get into the micronutrients down here. Well, nitrogen and sulfur are not micronutrients, those are macronutrients. But here, zinc, manganese, iron, copper, boron. And you notice they have little symbols next to them. So VH represents very high. It means 2.4 parts per million, which is a very low concentration, is still very high for boron. We'd like to be below 1 parts per million if we can. This is a high concentration and can cause an accumulation of boron in the plants and cause damage. Soluble salts is basically a salinity measure, and 2 millimoles per centimeter is low. Normally, we would consider 4 to be a saline soil, so it's below that level, but for grapevines, 2 millimoles is on the verge of being high. And the reason for this is in part because you're growing a perennial crop, and maybe you won't see damage in the first year, maybe not even the second year, but certainly by the 3rd and 4th year. And this will cause infertility in your flowers, and eventually you will see some damage to the leaves and the vine will die. So what do they do for recommendations here? Here, they've given us a list of comments here. Soluble salts, levels above 1.5 millimoles or decisiemens per meter may need to be reduced, and boron levels at 1.2 parts per million need to be watched carefully, and they recommend that you use leaching with good quality water here to reduce the salts and the boron in your soil. So if you have access to good quality water, it behooves you to leach those salts from the soil. And then you will be in good shape as long as you have a good source of water to irrigate with. So they recommend also some gypsum. This is largely to add calcium to the soil to help protect against that higher sodium levels in the soil, which can be damaging. And then they recommend elemental sulfur, not sulfate. Those are different things. Sulfate will not reduce the pH of your soil, but elemental sulfur will. This is a common misconception. It's very important that you use elemental sulfur to reduce the pH. Sulfate is already oxidized and will not produce any hydrogen ions to help lower the pH. Elemental sulfur will. It's a very important point. Okay, and then finally, site preparation. So you want to get in there before you're going to be planting the grapes. You want to start controlling your perennial weeds beforehand, whether that's just by tilling or hoeing if you have a small site, or if that's by chemical treatment. You want to get out a handle on your weeds well in advance, maybe a year or two in advance if you can do that, if you have that much planning ahead. You want to clear the site. You want to level the soil as much as you can so that you get uniform distribution of water and smooth the ground as needed. Now, if you have a hard pan, you want to rip the soil. You want to break through that hard pan. Otherwise, the roots won't grow down. You'll have shallow root system. You'll have problems with irrigation. You won't get nearly as good a growth as if you can break through that hard pan and get your roots to grow down through that. We've used in the past a drill or a bit on the back of a tractor and drilled down, a post hole digger type drill to break through the hard pan. The challenge with that is that you can make it like a clay pot. By drilling through the soil, you can create a hard pan around the edge of the hole, and the plant roots will not grow out of it. So if you do that, to break through your hard pan down deeper, you need to be sure to break the sides of the hole up so that the roots can expand out beyond that area that you've drilled out. And then you want to add soil amendments. You want to add the elemental sulfur if you're going to adjust the pH. We've never had to raise the pH in our soils. All our soils are alkaline soils above pH 7 usually, and we're trying to get the pH down. Generally speaking, you don't have to fertilize the soil. The soil probably has its own enough fertility, but there, again, you need your soil analysis to be sure of that. And generally speaking, it's recommended when you're getting vines started that you add about 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the first year, but none thereafter. You don't want excessive growth. I know that sounds like oxymoron, but excessive growth is going to cause large vegetative growth, which is going to make it much more sensitive in the fall and winter when you're looking for cold tolerance. It's going to make them less cold tolerant and much more susceptible to winter injury. Also, studies have been shown, and again, I go back to my friend Case Van Leeuwen at Cheval Blanc, that shows that the biggest factors that affect wine quality are, first of all, the climate, then the amount of water that you give the vines, and then the amount of nitrogen. And the lower the nitrogen, the better quality of grapes that you get. So with that, I thank you for listening for this short video on site preparation and soil analysis. And I look forward to talking to you in the future on the next episode.